in this lecture, what I want to present to you today in this lecture is sort of the argument of this book in a nutshell, but illustrated through an analysis of the COVID pandemic. What I want to try to show you is that if you adopt this perspective on cannibal capitalism, you will be able to understand a lot about why COVID took the form that it did, and how we are still struggling with the fallout. So let me begin by reminding you of something that I think we've all heard many, many times, namely that COVID-19 has served as a perverse diagnostic, meaning that it is something that has lit up all the fault lines in our society, especially fault lines of gender and color, nation and class. And that's absolutely true. Yet, I want to suggest that we are not hearing enough about the social system that generates those fault lines, even though, I'll suggest, it's the same social system that brought us the virus in the first place, and that has blocked our efforts to deal with it. So my proposal is to stop tiptoeing around, so to speak, and cut to the chase. What the pandemic actually diagnoses is the deep-seated dysfunctionality of capitalism. In my view, COVID is a perfect storm, a veritable orgy of capitalist irrationality and injustice. More than anything in recent memory, it has disclosed the system's multiple contradictions: ecological, political, social, and economic. All these contradictions are baked into a social order that incentivizes a profit-hungry class of owners and investors to devour the essential conditions of their existence and, of course, of what's worse, of our existence. It incentivizes them, in other words, to guzzle care work, to scarf up nature, to eviscerate public power, to wolf down the wealth of racialized populations, and to suck dry the energy and creativity of all working people. Those things that I just mentioned, I'm sorry, my phone is ringing and I think it'll stop very soon. Just hang on. Okay, apologies for that. So where was I? Yeah, the things that I just mentioned that the system is devouring are essential conditions of production and accumulation, as well as of life on the planet. And that's the rub. Capitalist society is structured in a way that begs the profit makers to gobble them up in order to fatten their share prices, while absolving them of any obligation to replenish what they take or to repair what they damage. The result is not only to leave a trail of wreckage across the globe, but also to destabilize the entire jerry-built edifice of capitalist society. So you see, those few sentences, I'll have to unpack it as I go along, but already encapsulated there is a theory of crisis, which of course is the theme of this conference. Okay, my idea then is that COVID offers a textbook demonstration of this idea of capitalism's inherent tendency to cannibalize the bases of its own existence and therefore to precipitate multiple crises. The pandemic, I claim, is an orgy where all of capitalism's contradictions converge, where cannibalization of nature, care work, and political capacity of peripheralized populations and working classes merge in a lethal binge. We cannot understand the pandemic properly without a proper understanding of capitalism, and understanding that capitalism is a cannibal. Let me explain. The word cannibalism has several meanings. The most familiar, the most concrete, the one that I'm sure first occurs to most of you, is the ritual eating of human flesh by a human being. Now, that meaning is burdened by a long racist history, because the term was applied by a kind of inverted logic to Black Africans who were on the receiving end of Euro-imperial predation. So I have to confess, I take a certain satisfaction in turning the tables and invoking this term here as a descriptor for the capitalist class, a group I want to show that feeds off of everyone else. But the term cannibalism also has a more abstract meaning, which captures a deeper truth about our society. The verb to cannibalize means, this is a dictionary definition, to deprive one facility or enterprise of an essential element of its functioning for the purpose of creating or sustaining another one. That, I want to show, is a fair approximation of the relation of capitalism's economy to its non-economic precincts, to the families and communities, habitats and ecosystems, state capacities and public powers, whose substance its economy consumes to engorge itself. The term cannibalism also has a specialized astronomical meaning. A celestial object is said to cannibalize another such object when it incorporates mass from the latter through gravitational attraction. That, I want to suggest here too, is an apt characterization of the process by which capital draws into its orbit natural and social wealth from peripheral zones of the world system. There is finally the Ouroboros, that's the self-cannibalizing serpent that eats its own tail, which is depicted on the cover of my book. That's a fitting image, I think, for a system that is wired to devour the social, political, and natural bases of its own existence, which, as I just said, are also the bases of our existence. All told, then, the cannibal metaphor offers several promising avenues for an analysis of capitalist society. It invites us to see that society as an institutionalized feeding frenzy in which the main course is us. Now, the word capitalism, too, cries out for clarification. That word is commonly used to name an economic system based on private property and market exchange, wage labor, and production for profit. But that definition is too narrow, obscuring rather than disclosing the system's true nature. The term capitalism, I suggest, better designates something larger, a societal order that empowers a profit-driven economy to prey on the extra economic supports it needs to function. These include wealth expropriated from nature and subject populations, multiple forms of care work, chronically undervalued when not wholly disavowed, public goods and public powers, which capital both requires and tries to curtail, the energy and creativity of working people. Now, none of these things appear on corporate balance sheets, but these forms of wealth are essential preconditions for the profits and monetized gains that do appear there. Vital underpinnings of accumulation, they too are constitutive components of the capitalist order. So in this lecture and in my book more generally, the term capitalism refers not to a type of economy, but to a type of society, one that authorizes an officially designated economy wired to pile up monetized value for investors and owners, to devour the non-economized wealth on which their gains depend. Serving up that wealth on a platter, as it were, to the corporate classes, this society invites them to make a meal of our creative capacities and of the earth that sustains us, while giving them no obligation to replenish what they consume or repair what they damage. And that, of course, is a recipe for trouble. Like the Ouroboros that eats its own tail, capitalist society is primed to devour its own substance, a veritable dynamo of self-destabilization. It periodically precipitates crises while routinely eating away at the bases of our existence. Well, what I've just sketched is an enlarged view of capitalism, a view of it as a cannibal. And this enlarged view represents an alternative to received understandings of our social system. These are inadequate, I claim, to grasp the true nature of the pandemic and of the larger crisis of which it's a part, because they are too narrow. They focus too single-mindedly on the system's official economy. They identify the core injustice of capitalist society with the exploitation of free-waged workers at the point of commodity production, and they designate the system's defining irrationality as its tendency to precipitate economic crises. Those identifications are not so much wrong as incomplete. Capitalist societies do indeed generate class exploitation and economic crises as a function of their structural dynamics. But they also give rise to additional injustices and irrationalities, which are equally structural and serious, but fail to appear on the radar of received understandings. These extra economic defects of capitalist society are deeply implicated in the present crisis. If we hope to interpret the latter correctly and to figure out how to overcome it, we need to develop a new expanded conception of capitalism that foregrounds not just the system's economy, but the relation of its economy to the latter's non-economic conditions of possibility. Now, I want to mention 4 such non-economic conditions for the possibility of a capitalist economy. The first is a sizable fund of unwaged or underwaged labor devoted to social reproduction. This labor includes housework, the birthing and rearing of children, the care of adults, including wage workers, the elderly, and the unemployed, all aimed at the making and sustaining of human beings. These activities of people-making constitute an indispensable precondition for profit-making. Without them, there could be no workers, no labor power, no necessary or surplus labor time, no exploitation, no surplus value, no accumulation of capital, no profit. Yet, capital accords these things, this activity of social reproduction, no inherent value. It is unconcerned to replenish it. It seeks to avoid paying for social reproductive work insofar as it can. So that's the first non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy. The second is a large fund of wealth expropriated from subjugated peoples, especially from racialized peoples. This wealth includes dependent, unfree, and unwaged or underwaged labor, but also expropriated land, looted mineral and energy deposits, human bodies and bodily organs, children and reproductive capacities, all of which do serve or have served as inputs to capitalist production, for which capital pays very little. or often nothing. Expropriated wealth was an indispensable source of capital stockpiling at the start of capitalism's history, as Marx maintained. But it did not cease with the system's ongoing development or maturation. On the contrary, the capitalist economy relies even now on a continuing stream of free or cheap inputs as major sources of accumulation, alongside and interimbricated with exploitation. Absent such expropriation of subject peoples, the exploitation of free workers would not be profitable. Yet capital disavows its reliance on such wealth and refuses to pay for its replenishment. Now, there's also a third non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy, and that's a large fund of so-called free gifts or cheap inputs from non-human nature. These supply the indispensable material substratum of capitalist production, the raw materials that labor transforms, the energy that powers machines, the foodstuffs that power bodies, and such general environmental conditions as arable land, breathable air, potable water, a habitable climate, and the carbon-carrying capacities of the Earth's atmosphere. In the absence of these natural inputs and ecological conditions, there could be no economic producers or social reproducers, no wealth to expropriate or free labor to exploit, no capital, no capitalists. And yet, here too, capital treats nature as a source of free or very cheap gifts to which it can help itself, but need not replenish or repair. Now that brings me to a fourth and last non-economic precondition for a capitalist economy, and that's a large fund of public goods supplied by states and other public powers. These include legal orders that guarantee property rights, contracts, and free exchange, repressive forces that ensure order, put down rebellions, manage dissent, and enable expropriation both within and beyond state territory. Also, a money supply that stores value and enables transactions across broad swaths of time and space, transport and communications infrastructure, and a variety of mechanisms for managing system crises. Absent these public goods, which the market cannot supply, there could be no social order, no trust, no exchange, no sustained accumulation. Yet capital tends to resent public power and seeks to weaken it, evading its regulations and the taxes that are necessary to sustain it. So here are four preconditions that are outside the official economy, but necessary props to sustain it. Each of them represents an indispensable presupposition. Each harbors social relations, social activities, and forms of social wealth that together form the sine qua non for accumulation. Behind capitalism's official institutions, wage labor, production, exchange, finance, stand their necessary supports and enabling conditions. Families, communities, nature, territorial states, political organizations, civil societies, and not least of all, massive amounts and multiple forms of unwaged and expropriated labor. Fundamentally integral to capitalist society, these things too are constitutive elements of it. Capitalism, in other words, is no mere economy, but something far larger. It's an institutionalized social order that includes the non-economized zones on which the economy relies. So here then is an expanded view of capitalism, a view of it as a cannibal, truth be told, an omnivore. This view has a decisive advantage over standard understandings. Unlike them, the concept of cannibal capitalism allows us to scrutinize something crucial, namely the relation established in capitalist society between the system's economy and its background conditions. These relations, I want to argue, are contradictory and perverse. Economic actors, so-called, whom the system wires to accumulate capital, have every incentive to drain wealth from the society's non-economic zones while offloading the costs onto others. By definition, then, capitalism is a cannibal, primed to guzzle its own conditions of possibility. Necessarily, then, it generates multiple injustices and irrationality beyond those widely recognized economic ones. Deeply implicated in the present crisis, but invisible to received understandings, these contradictions appear with blazing clarity when we assume this expanded conception. So we get from this conception access to an expanded catalog of capitalist injustices above and beyond the received focus on class exploitation. Whereas that injustice resides, if you like, within the system's economy, others are grounded rather in the divisions between the capitalist economy and its non-economic conditions of possibility. The division between economic production, where labor is remunerated in cash wages, and social reproduction, where it is often unwaged or chronically underwaged, where it is sentimentalized and sometimes recompassed in love. That division is a case in point. It's historically a gendered division, of course, and it entrenches a fundamental gender asymmetry at the heart of capitalist societies, one that grounds the subordination of women, as well as gender binarism and heteronormativity. Similarly, capitalist societies institute a structural division between free workers who can exchange their labor power for the cost of their reproduction and dependent, unfree, or semi-free others whose persons and assets can simply be seized. Unable to access rights, protections, or the full costs of their own reproduction, the latter group, which is huge, seen globally, provides capital with a stream of free or cheap inputs that swell the tide of profit. So this status division between the merely exploitable and the downright expropriable is fundamental to capitalist society, coinciding roughly but unmistakably with the global color line, as W.B. Du Bois named it. This division undergirds a range of structural injustices, including racial oppression, imperialisms, old and new, indigenous dispossession, and genocide. Then, too, capitalist societies institute a sharp division between human beings and non-human nature, which henceforth cease to belong to the same ontological universe. Reduced to a tap on the one hand and a sink on the other, non-human nature is opened to brute extractivism and instrumentalization. If this is not an injustice against nature or against non-human animals, as many would claim, it is at the very least an injustice against existing and future generations of human beings who are left with an increasingly inhabitable planet. Finally, capitalism institutes a structural division between the economic and the political. On one side stands the private power of capital to organize production, using only the lash of hunger and need. On the other, the public power of the state, which monopolizes legitimate violence and incarnates law. Now, the effect of this division is to truncate the scope of the political, expelling from the public agenda a range of life and death questions, such as who shall have access to the vaccine and to therapeutics and to the ability to protect themselves from global pandemics, and who shall not. Devolving those matters to capital, capitalist societies offer only a very poor and shrunken facsimile of democracy. Subjecting supposedly self-governing citizens to capital's arbitrary rule, these societies are veritable cauldrons of political injustice. So what I'm suggesting is that an expanded view of capitalist society makes visible an enlarged catalog of structural injustices. These are every bit as deep-seated and non-accidental as class exploitation. But that's not all. The expanded view also enlarges our view of what counts as capitalist crisis, above and beyond irrationalities internal to its economy. We can see now, for example, that capitalism harbors a structural tendency to crises of social reproduction. Insofar as capital tries to disavow the unwaged care work on which it depends, it periodically puts enormous pressure on the chief providers of that work, families, communities, and above all, women. The current financialized form of capitalist society is generating just such a crisis today in a very acute form, as it demands both retrenchment of public provision of social services and vastly increased hours of waged work per household, including from women. The expanded view also discloses an inherent tendency to ecological crisis, insofar as capital works overtime to avoid paying anything close to the true replacement costs of the inputs it takes from non-human nature. Depleting the soil and befouling the seas, this system floods carbon sinks and overwhelms the carbon-carrying capacities of the planet, helping itself to many forms of natural wealth, while disavowing repair and replacement costs. It periodically destabilizes the metabolic interaction between the human and non-human components of nature. I don't need to belabor now how acute this is at the present, given climate change. Now, capitalism's tendencies to ecological and social reproductive crises are inseparable from its constitutive reliance on expropriated wealth from racialized peoples, its reliance on stolen lands, coerced labor, and looted minerals, its dependence on racialized zones as dumping grounds for toxic waste and as suppliers of underpaid care work, increasingly organized in global care chains. The result is an entwining of economic, ecological, and social crisis with imperialism and racial ethnic antagonism. Neoliberalism has upped the ante here as well. Finally, the enlarged view of capitalism discloses a deep-seated tendency to political crisis. Here, too, capital tries to have it both ways, living off public goods for which it tries not to pay. Primed to evade taxes and to weaken state regulatory capacities, it tends to hollow out the very public powers on which it depends. The current financialized form of capitalism takes this game to a whole new level. Mega corporations outgun territorially tethered public powers, while global finance disciplines states, making a mockery of elections and preventing our rulers from addressing popular claims, even if they wanted to, which of course not all of them do. The result is a major crisis of governance, which is now joined to a crisis of hegemony, as masses of people across the globe defect from established political parties and common sense. In general, then, the expanded view of capitalism as a cannibal discloses that this system harbors multiple crisis tendencies above and beyond the economic. Now, all of this serves, I believe, to clarify the present conjuncture. The COVID pandemic, as I said, strikes me as a switch point where all of capitalism's injustices and irrationalities converge, where the cannibalization of nature, care work, and political capacity of peripheralized populations and working classes merge in a lethal binge. So I want now to take a closer look at this conjuncture. Capitalism as a cannibal. Now let's start first with nature, the site of the system's ecological contradiction. It was none other than capital's cannibalization of that vital support of its own existence and of ours that exposed humans to SARS-CoV-2 in the first place. Long harbored by bats in remote caves, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 made the zoonotic leap to us in 2019 by way of some bridging species not yet definitively identified, possibly pangolins. But what brought the bats into contact with that intermediary species and the latter into contact with us is crystal clear, namely the combined effects of global warming on the one hand and tropical deforestation on the other. Both of those processes are progeny of capital, driven by its hunger for profit. Together, they, that is global warming and tropical deforestation, eviscerated the habitats of innumerable species, triggering mass migrations, creating new proximities among previously distant and now distressed organisms, and promoting novel transfers of pathogens among them. That dynamic had already, even before COVID, precipitated a string of viral epidemics, each passed from bats to humans via some amplifying host: AIDS, Nipah, SARS, MERS, and now COVID-19. That's not the end of the story. More such epidemics will come. They are the non-accidental byproducts of a social order that puts nature at the mercy of capital. Incentivized to appropriate biophysical wealth as quickly and cheaply as possible, with no responsibility for repair or replenishment, those dedicated to amassing profit decimate rainforests and bombard the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. Hell-bent on accumulation in every era, but massively empowered by neoliberalization, they let loose an escalating cascade of lethal plagues. Well, COVID's effects on humans would be horrific under any conditions, but they have been made incalculably worse by another strand of the present crisis, rooted in another structural contradiction of capitalist society, which has also been sharpened to a fever pitch in the neoliberal era. It is, after all, not just nature that capital has cannibalized in this period, but also public power. Ooh. Can you still hear me? I'm worried that there's...
That's all right. We are still here. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, good. Perfect. I lost you for a second. All right. I was worried that something went wrong. So, yeah. So nature is not the only thing that's been cannibalized, but also public power. And as I argued before, that too is an essential ingredient of capital's diet, avidly consumed in every phase of the system's development, but devoured with special ferocity over the last 40 years. And that's the catch. The political capacities that financialized capitalism has gorged on are precisely those we could have used to mitigate the pandemic. but no such luck. Well, before the COVID outbreak, many states had already bowed to the demands of the markets, which is to say the mega corporations, by slashing social spending, including in public health infrastructure and basic research. With a few exceptions, notably Cuba, they drew down stockpiles of life-saving equipment, gutted diagnostic capacities, and shrank coordination and treatment capacities. Having eviscerated public health infrastructure, moreover, our rulers devolved vital healthcare functions to profit-driven providers and insurers, to pharmaceuticals and manufacturers. These firms, which are constitutionally uninterested in and unconstrained by the public interest, now control the lion's share of the world's health-related resources. The labor forces and raw materials, the machinery and production facilities, the supply chains and intellectual property, the research institutions and personnel, everything in sum, which taken together determines our fates, individual and collective. Committed to preserving their profit streams, these actors form a private force majeure that blocks concerted public action on behalf of humanity. The effects are tragic but unsurprising. A social system that subjects matters of life and death to the so-called law of value was structurally primed from the get-go to abandon untold millions to COVID-19. But that's not all. The collapse of already weak public systems converged with another structural contradiction of capitalist society, one centered on social reproduction. Always a staple of capitalist consumption, care work has been voraciously gobbled up by it in recent years. The same regime that divested from public care infrastructure also broke unions and drove down wages, compelling increased hours of paid work per household, including from primary caregivers. In other words, neoliberalism offloaded care work onto families and communities at just the moment when it was commandeering the social energies we needed to perform it. The effect was to turn capitalism's inherent tendency to destabilize social reproduction into an acute care crunch. COVID's advent has intensified this strand of crisis too, dumping major new care chores on families and communities, especially onto women who still do the lion's share of unpaid care work. Under lockdown, of course, childcare and schooling shifted into people's home, leaving caregivers to take on that burden on top of others in confined domestic spaces, quite ill-suited to those purposes. Many employed women and caregivers ended up quitting their jobs to care for kids and other relatives, while many others were laid off by employers. Both groups have faced and will still face major losses in position and pay if and when they rejoin the workforce. A third group, privileged to keep their jobs and work remotely from home while also performing care work, including for housebound kids, were forced to take multitasking to new heights of craziness. A fourth group, which includes both women and men, bore the honorific essential workers, but was paid a pittance and treated as disposable, required to brave the threat of infection daily, along with the fear of bringing it home, in order to produce and distribute the stuff that enabled others to shelter in place. In each of these cases, the work of social reproduction, swollen by the pandemic, still fell and still falls largely to women, as it has in every phase of capitalism's history. But which women end up in which category depends on color and class. So let's look briefly at those. Structural racism, of course, is a built-in feature of capitalist society, as I suggested earlier, and it has infused every aspect of the current crisis. At the global level, it colors the ecological strand of the crisis, as capital quenches its thirst for cheap nature, largely by seizing land, energy, and mineral wealth from racialized populations who've been deprived of political protection and actionable rights. Having been subjected variously to conquest, enslavement, genocide, and dispossession, those populations now, or their descendants, now bear an undue share of the global environmental load, disproportionately vulnerable to toxic dumping, natural disasters, and multiple lethal impacts of global warming. They now find themselves last in line for vaccination and therapeutics. At the national level, meanwhile, race inflects the political and social reproductive strands of the crisis too, as communities of color are denied access to conditions that promote health, to affordable high-quality medical care, to clean water, nutritious food, safe working and living conditions. No wonder then that their members were and still are disproportionately infected and killed by COVID-19. The reasons are not mysterious: poverty and inferior health care, pre-existing medical conditions linked to stress, poor nutrition, and exposure to toxins, overrepresentation in frontline jobs that cannot be performed remotely, lack of resources that would permit them to refuse unsafe work, and lack of labor rights that would permit them to win protections, inferior housing and living arrangements that don't allow for social distancing and that facilitate transmission, diminished access to vaccines and therapeutics. Together, these conditions have expanded the meaning of the slogan Black Lives Matter, synergizing with its original reference to police violence and incarceration, and helping to fuel ongoing protests. Color, of course, is deeply entwined with class in the capitalist world system generally, and in the present period particularly. In fact, the two are hard to separate, as the category essential worker shows. If we leave aside medical professionals, that designation covers migrant farm workers, immigrant meat packing and slaughterhouse workers, Amazon warehouse pickers, UPS drivers, nursing home aides, hospital cleaners, supermarket stockers and cashiers, those who deliver groceries and take out meals. Especially dangerous in COVID times, these jobs are mostly low-paid, non-unionized, and precarious, bereft of benefits and labor protections, subject to intrusive supervision and relentless speed-up. Although others hold some of them too, they are disproportionately filled by women and people of color. Taken together, these jobs and those who perform them represent the face of the working class in financialized capitalism. No longer epitomized by the figure of the white male miner, factory operative, or construction worker, that class now consists paradigmatically of caregivers and low-wage service workers and all of the groups I just described, paid far less than the costs of its reproduction when paid at all. It is expropriated as well as exploited. COVID has exposed that dirty secret as well by juxtaposing the essential character of the working class's work to capital's systematic undervaluation of that work. The pandemic testifies to another major contradiction of capitalist society, namely the inability of markets in labor power to accurately reckon the real worth of labor. In general, then, COVID is a perfect storm or veritable orgy of cannibal capitalist irrationality and injustice. By ratcheting up the system's inherent defects to the breaking point, it shines a piercing beam on all the structural contradictions of our society. Dragging them out from the shadows and into the daylight, the pandemic reveals capital's inherent drive to cannibalize nature up to the very brink of planetary conflagration, to divert our capacities away from the truly essential work of social reproduction, to eviscerate public power to the point where it cannot solve the problems the system generates, to feed off the ever-decreasing wealth and health of racialized people, to not only exploit but also expropriate the working class. In truth, we could not ask for a better lesson in social theory. But now comes the hard part, putting that lesson to work in political practice. Thank you very much for your attention.
So much. So you can see the people here. There are 40, 50 people around, I think.
Hi, everybody.
So we have some time for some 4 or 3 questions from the public here. I've got a few, but I'm sure everyone, the students, the professors here want to ask some comments or questions to you. So I can bring you the mic so that she can hear what you have to say. So, any people want to ask some questions? Si vous voulez poser vos questions, vous pouvez les poser en français. I think, Dr. Fraser, you can push the interpretation button in French to hear it in French, or I can... Ah oui, vous comprenez? OK, great, parfait. Donc, en français ou en anglais, en French and English. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions, des remarques, des commentaires? Any questions here? People? Maybe I can start with one question, but if there's nobody here, what is to be done? So the question about the present crisis, actually in some countries, the far right, like in Italy, Sweden, Trump is still there. And what the left should do now to face this big orgy of cannibal capitalism. So what is to be done? That's a big question, but I don't know if you have some pathway to organize or do something.
Yeah,
yeah, thank you.
It's a huge question. There's a echo, is it? Yeah, it's a huge. Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm okay. It's a huge question, and you know, I do have some ideas, but they're not at the sort of concrete level of, you know, a list of actions to take. I think the most important thing is that things have gotten to such a point of crisis that we do really face, on top of all of these structural crises of ecology, politics, nature care, and so on, we also face a crisis of hegemony, and that is this sense of that widespread feeling that something has to give, that things cannot go on in the same way, that it's time for some out-of-the-box thinking. And as you rightly suggest, so far, various truly vicious and ugly forms of authoritarian right-wing populism and chauvinism and white supremacy and so on have been the primary beneficiaries of this situation. And in general, there have been some promising left-wing responses. I would say in the US, the Bernie Sanders campaigns, the 2 presidential campaigns, right, represented something, well, not perfect, but, you know, something in the right direction. You know, we had for a while Podemos in Spain, Syriza in Greece before it compromised, and so on. So it shows that that what's needed is a left-wing response that is every bit as large and bold and radical as this right-wing response, but which gives people an alternative narrative, an alternative diagnosis of what the true cause of the problem are, which says it's not immigrants, it's not Muslims, it's not Mexicans, Jews, Blacks, et cetera, but capital is the cannibal here. And I think there's an impressive amount of what I would call emancipatory or potentially emancipatory activism. People are engaged in many, many parts of the globe in very impressive struggles. Maybe the Iranian case is at the moment the sort of poster child for something that's really promising. We don't know how that will play out ultimately. There's lots of engagement and energy. I would say the problem is that it is dispersed and fragmented. People are organizing, and rightly so, around the issues that are most urgent and pressing in their specific situations, whether it's vulnerability to murder on the street by police, or horrible wildfires, or whatever it is. There's no one experience of this crisis that is sort of epitomizes everything. And people live it differently because the system is quite differentiated and complex. So I think what's needed is a way to connect the dots. A way that people can continue to engage in what is most pressing and urgent for them, but with a clearer or more vivid sense of how it relates to the larger crisis, and therefore to all the other groups in motion who suffer in somewhat different ways from the crisis and who are also mobilizing. So this is what I'm trying to do here in this lecture and in this book, is offer at least one proposal, it may not be the only one or the best one, for how to connect the dots so that the impressive forms of engagement can begin to coalesce in a more in a somewhat stronger way, cooperate more closely, and with the ultimate hope that what results from this is, I'm using Gramsci's language, a counter-hegemonic bloc, right? Right now, some of the right-wing populist movements are trying to form a kind of counter-hegemonic bloc. And that's what I think the left has to do, and one that can go. We have two enemies, I want to say. We have the right wing, really ugly stuff as our enemy, but we also have the quote unquote progressive neoliberals as our enemy. Those who say, Trump is so scary, drop all your radical egalitarian ideas and, close ranks with the liberals. The problem is the liberals are in bed with the banks and the mega corporations, and they're the ones who, in a sense, brought us neoliberalization in the first place, at least in the United States, and I believe in Canada as well. So we have to be able to fight both of these enemies at the same time. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for this generous answer. So we have 3 questions in the room. So are you okay for an extra 10 minutes
Yes.
with us? Perfect. Thank you so much. So we have Alexa here. You can ask her a question.
Thank you for that inspiring discussion. One of the things that capitalism has been so good at over the years is to find ways to constantly open new frontiers for exploitation, expropriation, that has made it such that it hasn't collapsed the way that all of us had hoped over time. So what's your thought on what the new frontiers are going to be of additional exploitation and expropriation that could make it nevertheless sustainable, or have we hit, in your opinion, some kind of turning point?
Thank you very much. I think that's a really important question. And I have to say that I'm not sort of a fan of the kind of collapse theory of crisis. I think that it's not that accumulation stops. It's not, I think that the investor class is so immensely, creative in its insidious way that, it finds ways to create new financial vehicles and data mining and, all kinds of amazing stuff that if that intelligence were put to some, good use, we might even be able to benefit. But I don't think the issue is that the profit making side of this is going to collapse. I think what's more likely is that ecosystems are going to collapse, and that the capacity for political organization may collapse. We may get some kind of a war of all against all, really ugly resource wars and so on and so forth. I think the bigger danger is a collapse of nature and a collapse of civilization. Capital is probably doing just fine. So what I rely on is not for the system to break down in its economic sense, but rather for us to respond to an increasing non-livability under these conditions. And that is how the general crises of this severity have been resolved in the past. There have been not many, but a few in capitalism's history. And basically in every case, what the result has been a significant structural renovation or change in the nature of capitalism, say from liberal colonial competitive capitalism to social democratic or New Deal capitalism, and then with the unraveling of that to neoliberal capitalism. So there's we're in one of those interregnum moments in the history of the system of crisis. And the question is, who will succeed? This is why this problem of counter-hegemony is so important. Who will succeed in creating the kind of counter-hegemonic bloc that can, in a sense, direct the transition? And this leaves the question, transition to what? Transition to a new form of capitalism, maybe something that will call itself green capitalism, or transition to some form of post-capitalism, whether it's something really nasty or something desirable. All of those questions are up in the air, but I do think I can't give the knockdown argument. But to me, green capitalism is very implausible. So I have trouble imagining what the successor form of capitalism could be, if there can be one. I don't know. If there is a game changer, it is climate change. If there is an objective limit, that's it. So that's why I think I'm putting my money on a post-socialist, a post-capitalist, eco-socialist kind of alternative. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Nancy, Fraser. So we have two questions that I think we'll take back in a row. So the first one, you can open the mic here, and then if you can try to answer both questions at the same time or one after the other. So you go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for the time you took. I have a question concerning, you wrote in one of your texts previously that there was like a contradiction of capitalism where, for example, if I would have like an organization where I plant trees, I would be like helping capitalists by doing jobs they don't want to do, so like giving back to nature. And so during the pandemic, like everybody applauded people in the care system and everyone like saying good job and everything, while these people were actually like helping capitalism continue to grow. And so what can, like, for example, care workers do like on an individual level to like do a like counterpower to this capitalist like social order? Is there something they could do to like go a bit their own way and help people without going in this system?
Perfect. And the other one? Thank
So thank you for that lecture, and I have to comment that you do a fantastic job of personalizing and humanizing the effects of capitalism and the victims of capitalism. But my question is, why do we people who agree on that, why do we people who agree on that not personalize and humanize the perpetrators? Why is capitalism so impersonal and abstract? We've had in Canada recently a number of cases where large corporations, very well known, have been caught in various kinds of criminal activities, corruption, these sorts of things. In one case, one of our banks who had involved in defrauding 3 million customers, they plead guilty to one charge and they pay an amount of money. But I think if the CEO and president of that bank were put in prison for 10 years, maybe the bank would change the nature of its work. So that's the basis of it.
So we can go ahead and maybe it's the N word now for you. Thank you.
Okay.
Perfect.
Well, these are two terrific questions. In response to the first, I want to say that I think it's important to try as best we can, maybe it's not easy, but to distinguish between reforms that are system conforming and that end up, serving as either coping mechanisms or even forms of that unintentionally end up subsidizing employers of low wage labor, for example. Distinguish between those system conforming reforms and reforms. I'm thinking of the French political ecologist Andre Gortz talked about non-reformist reforms that set in motion, that alter the balance of power and set in motion a process, a trajectory that can empower people to make progressively deeper and more radical claims for more radical reforms. Those would be system challenging reforms. As I say, this is not an easy distinction to draw when you're faced with a concrete case, but I think it's still very important to try to anticipate the ways in which certain kinds of reforms are more easily functionalized by the system as coping mechanisms and so on. Now, that's not to say that people don't need to cope. There are things that when you're in dire straits, you can't blame anybody for that. But you asked about constituting counterpower. What can people concerned with the caregiving issue do? I guess to me, it's more important than the way individuals figure out how to meet their care needs in a way that is, they can not feel they're doing something nasty and dirty by underpaying or exploiting or expropriating others. I think more important than what individuals do at that level is are engaging in campaigns for the rights of domestic workers, of people who provide care in institutional settings. Struggles for unions are extremely important, for migrant rights, because a lot of this work is done by migrants, some of whom don't have papers. I know, in other words, I would look at the level of policy change rather than individual ethical behavior, even though, of course, individual ethical behavior is something we all have a responsibility to do. And I think in a way, that's what I want to say in response also at another level to the second question, because I'm all for locking these guys up. Absolutely. On the way here to do this lecture with you, I was driving home and heard about the Texas two-step. I don't know if that phrase is circulating where you are, but this is a new legal way that corporations are avoiding legally mandated obligations to people they poison. So where there have been large court settlements against, say, people that are causing asbestos poisoning or whatever, they deal with it by dividing the company's assets into two and putting all the assets that involve these these costs into one separate corporation, keeping everything that's profitable into another, and declaring bankruptcy for the first, so they don't pay. I mean, and this is perfectly legal, apparently, although maybe there'll be some changes. So they're the bad actors. They're the way the system encourages bad acting and incentivizes it. And this is another example of the creativity that these guys have. They're always one step ahead of the regulators, right? They're way ahead of us. So again, yes, put them in jail. But also, let's change the law so that they can't do it, and let's change the whole incentive structure of the system. Let's end offshore tax havens and all of that stuff. Why? One last point on this. You asked why not personalize them? Why talk so abstractly about capital? And I do have another thought about this, and that is, this question of what a left, whether we call it left socialist or left populist, what differentiates that from right populism? There's a long history of right populism, humanizing and personalizing capital. It's the figure of the Jew, and so on. A left-wing populism has to avoid concretizing the enemy in identitarian or particularistic or culturalistic terms, whether we're talking about the scapegoated enemy at the bottom that right populism demonizes, or capital is a function. It's not an identity. And I worry about, overly concrete accounts of it. So what at least what I am trying to do is encourage people to think about how a system works to incentivize actors. And as I say, I'm happy to lock them up, but I don't want to personalize them, at least in that sense I just outlined.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time and your Thank you, everyone. So we'll stop the recording now, and thank you so much for being here. Let's keep in touch, and
Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the questions.
perfect. Have a good day. Thank you so much.